Cocaine is a highly addictive drug derived from coca leaves, frequently abused for its stimulating effects. Classified as a Schedule II drug under the Controlled Substances Act, it is recognized for its high potential for abuse. Over the years, its detrimental impact has been particularly profound, affecting the lives of millions, with an unfortunate impact on African American communities.
But how does such a substance fuel such struggle and racial injustice in these communities? Centuries prior to the isolation of cocaine's chemical compound, indigenous people in South America utilized the coca plant and its leaves, chewing them for their stimulating and energizing properties. Spanish conquistadors brought the leaves to Europe, and as time grew, its popularity increased for recreational use. In 1860, German chemist Albert Niemann isolated the active ingredient in the leaves, transforming it into a white powdery form. Snorting the powder seemed to enter it into the bloodstream fast and effectively, which caused the user to have stimulating effects. Recognizing its notable numbing effect, this discovery launched cocaine into the medical scene. But during the early 1980s, it was found that dissolving powdered cocaine in a water-ammonia mixture and bringing it to a boil formed a solid substance. Once the solid was separated from the liquid, dried out, and broken into rock chunks, it could be smoked. The substance took the name of crack cocaine. People could now gain similar stimulating effects found in cocaine for a much cheaper price. Compared to cocaine, crack resulted in short, intense highs, which led to intense cravings that influenced addiction. Crack hit the streets of major cities such as Miami, LA, New York, and DC, spreading like wildfire due to it being highly addictive. While cocaine was about $50 a bag, crack users could get high for just $5 to $10. Due to its competitively low prices, the new variation of the drug was distributed all across the US and saw a massive spike in users. From 1985 to 1989, the number of cocaine users saw a 40% increase. While crack was maneuvering into all the crevices of America, it eventually struck black communities.
Historical patterns of segregation and redlining confined African Americans to specific and dense neighborhoods with limited resources. They found themselves positioned at the disadvantaged end of society, contending with the burdens of racial bias and systemic inequality. This circumstance translated into diminished economic opportunities, consequently leading to poverty. The dealing of crack in black communities offered economic incentives for individuals who saw it as a means to generate income in these economically deprived areas. For some, selling crack wasn't a choice. It was the only escape from the crushing weight of poverty. Despite the inherent risks and illegality, it appeared to be the sole recourse in the face of daunting circumstances. This avenue became a temporary escape from the persistent cycle of poverty. These situations and circumstances would be known as the crack epidemic.
Following the massive spike in cocaine users, the government and general public grew concerned about the issue. As Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, recognizing the harmful effects of crack cocaine, he vowed to reprioritize the war on drugs, an ongoing government-led campaign that aimed to stop illegal drug use, distribution, and trade.
America's children. And while drug and alcohol abuse cuts across all generations, it's especially damaging to the young people on whom our future depends.
Joe Biden, a U.S. Senator at the time, came forward with a bill concerned by the impact of drug abuse. This was following the deaths of the famous basketball player Jen Bias and NFL star Don Rogers from cocaine overdose, which further pressured the U.S. government into taking action. The proposed bill would be known as the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which Reagan signed into law. This law established a disparity between the amount of powder cocaine versus crack needed to trigger certain criminal penalties with a weight ratio of 100 to 1. For example, this means 5 grams of crack gave the same sentence as 500 grams of cocaine, both being a minimum of 5 years. While the intent of the law was to discourage the dealing of crack, many would say it promoted racial injustice.
Immediately preceding the passing of the law, there was a heightened emphasis on law enforcement to take crack cases more seriously. However, police disproportionately targeted black communities over any other, despite the fact that 2/3 of crack users were either white or Hispanic.
There is a heavy push to try to retain a level of order in the society. As a part of that, it ends up resulting in a very heavy policing of Black and brown communities, communities that were saw as contributing to a lot of the disorder that had happened during the 60s and the 70s. Now, this perceived disorder was things, civil rights movement, things of that sort. So there were elements of the society that were not happy with civil rights movements and rather thought that, okay, what we need to do is try to get things back to the way they were, and it's done through the language of law and order. So we want to start heavily policing these areas.
A shocking statistic found that 85% of those convicted for crack possession were Black, while 10% were white and 5% Hispanic. For those convicted of crack trafficking, a similar pattern can be recognized, with 88% being Black, while only 4% were white and 7% Hispanic. These statistics show an overwhelming majority of arrests being African American, even though they only made up 1/3 of crack users. Racial inequality did not stop there. In the years following the passing of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, African American sentencing grew to be 49% longer than whites who committed the same offense. This meant that African Americans were not only more likely to be arrested, but more likely to stay imprisoned for longer. It was discovered that Black incarceration rates skyrocketed from about 600 per 100,000 to 1,800 per 100,000 between the years 1970 and 2000. During the same time period, whites only went up from 100 per 100,000 to 240 per 100,000. With a massive surge in incarceration rates primarily within African areas, families' loved ones were locked up left and right, losing vital income streams in an already economically deprived environment.
Media coverage on the issue only made matters worse. News stations were very selective and exaggerated with their coverage, often exclusively reporting on urban areas, particularly with high Black populations. They emphasize the crime and violence in these settings, failing to address the underlying socioeconomic factors that may have led to those situations, such as poverty, lack of economic opportunity, and racial bias. The framing of these stories contributed to a skewed public perception and countrywide panic, believing that the crack epidemic and crimes were mainly due to the fault of African Americans.
One of the ways in which the media, when it discusses the crack epidemic, for example, would almost all the time use a Black or a brown person, Black or brown face, when talking about this epidemic. So what it did was it socialized the society to attach crack usage and the kind of stereotype of the quote crackhead with Black and brown people.
This fueled further racism and negative stereotypes and resulted in a cycle of arrest.
The long-term impact of the crack epidemic is one that is still rampant today. The crack epidemic's ripple effects on Black communities were devastating, with mass incarceration tearing family members from families and leaving mothers strained by addiction. Mothers, often struggling with addiction and the weight of single parenthood, faced immense social and economic challenges. The stigma surrounding addiction made it difficult to seek help, further isolating families and perpetuating cycles of poverty. Extended families, traditionally a source of support, were buckled under the additional burden, weakening community networks. Children caught in the crossfire endured emotional and psychological scars. Studies show that they were twice as likely to experience emotional and behavioral problems compared to children from non-crack affected families, according to the National Institute on Drug Abuse. This trauma often spilled over into the next generation, contributing to the cycles of poverty and addiction.
The crack epidemic was a turning point in history because of its enduring impact on African Americans short-term, as well as its long-term effects still existing today. Although not purposely, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 caused already existing racial injustice and bias to become more apparent. The media played a role in propagating widespread fear on the epidemic, driving a skewed perception of African Americans. Despite later revisions of the law in coming years, the damage had already been done. Upcoming generations still fall victim to poverty, bearing the economic weight of incarcerated family members, all while narratives pushed in the past slither its way to society today. This is why it is crucial to acknowledge and reveal the truth of the past in order to set up a future of equality.